Greetings. It's wonderful to be with you tonight, and I'm honored to be here as at least the second choice of speaker. I can think of a half a dozen folks I would do very well tonight. Some of them are in this room. Father Howe, I know, had passed the ball to me. As full as my plate may be, his plate is fuller. So I'm happy to be here and address you tonight. There's another man in the room whom some of you may know, Mr. Richard Ailman, and we're helping him develop a course he's been working on for a number of years now in the Archdiocese, and helping him to get this targeted to the audience it's supposed to go to, his course on Catholic social teaching, which begins here, well, not here, but here in Northeast at St. Clement, over about a mile or so in this basic direction, northeasty of Northeast. And this course I would consider to be fundamental for an enterprise like this, so that all members should, as soon as they can, avail themselves of this course. Right now it's being taught in 9 parts, and we hope to be able to help Richard present this every year. But right now we're hosting, due to the help of a generous grant from Catholic Community Foundation. And Richard is got material and space for, I think, at least 25 more spots left in his course. You can sign up on Holy Cross website. He's going to be over here somewhere, I think, at the end of the evening to talk to you about that. It's really expensive, I think like $50. So I would say if you're here this evening because something has stirred in your heart about the ideal of this guild, and especially if anything I say tonight, which was at least written to meet Richard's approval, strikes a chord in you, please consider carving out time to take this 9-part course taught on Tuesday evenings. He'll tell you more about that. Noticing your motto as I was coming in, connecting job seekers with Catholic businesses. How innocuous, how harmless. What harm could anyone possibly imagine could come from such a modest goal? And it reminds me a little bit of one of the apologies of Justin Martyr back in the early days of the church, when the church was under some persecution and under threat and suspicion by the Roman authority, and Justin Martyr wanted to represent Christianity to the Roman power. And basically, I'm paraphrasing, he said, look, we're a harmless community who worships Christos, and we say some prayers, and we share a meal, and we care for our sick and our dead. So we're no threat to the empire. And he was thinking to himself, he didn't write it. Oh yes, and we're also calling down from heaven the spiritual energy which will wrest this empire away from you and remake it in the image of that same humble Christos. So I think that there's something happening here that you're responding to, which is far more profound than can be or even should be represented in this humble motto that you offer. And it's to that I want to speak this evening. Title of my talk, The Christian Businessman in the New Spiritual Economy. So we're not talking about the new information economy, nor the new social media economy or anything like that, as interesting and helpful even as a good talk on those things could be. There is such a thing as a spiritual economy. The word economy means at its root in Greek, the laws which govern the care and nourishing of the home and life of the home. Thinking of the word in this way, we should be able to see that the so-called economy of the global West today is often more like an anti-economy in the classical sense. They rather often represent laws which put the good care of the home under profound stress. The reason for this is that the spiritual economy of our society has been radically degraded. And so this leads us directly to the proper object of our discussion. How is the true spiritual economy, which in fact constitutes the life of the church, that is, the commerce between heaven and earth, that is the very stuff of Christianity, to be restored in our society? In no other way but first to restore it to the lives of Christians. And this is the task. This is our task. So my talk this evening, I want to tie together two issues that I see as fundamental to the intuitions that are driving the founding of the St. Joseph Business Guild. And I don't even mean to say that they've been conceptualized in this way, but rather that, like most good Christian movements, they form in an inarticulate conviction about a need and a reading of the times. The first is that the St. Joseph Business Guild is inspired by the idea and reality of the medieval craft guilds in their most developed and pristine form. And the second is this knowledge that Christendom is over. And we're entering, and as a matter of fact have been for some time, into a new apostolic age. An age in which increasingly the only relevant Catholicism will be that which is radically conscious of itself as a spiritual community in opposition to the secular city. Now, what do I mean by the word secular here? The Canadian Roman Catholic philosopher Charles Taylor, himself somewhat of a, in my humble opinion, a victim of the secular society, but nevertheless is capable of reading it well, says that our society is secular not because Christianity is outlawed, it's not, and not even because it's often socially frowned upon, considered a thing of the past, misunderstood, ignored, or thought by many to be an evil. It is thought to be those things. Rather, our age is secular because belief and faith is just one option among many. Our society is ideologically pluralist. And Christians live then with the awareness that there are alternative views of the world and human life, that many reasonable, intelligent, educated, and sophisticated people apparently find satisfying and hold with conviction. And so it follows that among Christians, there's a fragility of belief. That's Taylor's term. He says, Christians know that for any truth claim they might make, there is some rival claim that bears serious weight for many people. And so in such a climate, Christians tend to hold their religious commitments with a degree of doubt. Maybe the Christian view of the world isn't the only valid view, or even the best or truest. This abiding doubt about one's faith is paralyzing. Christians find it difficult to expand and deepen their religious commitments and to translate them into action, especially social and public action. In the meantime, the secular drum of society beats constantly in our ears, beckoning, demanding that we check our faith at the door of the town hall and enter the value-neutral public square of tolerance, so-called value-neutral. There's no such thing, of course. The secular song is enchanting and powerful music, difficult to resist, and Christians become secularized almost by necessity. We're vulnerable to a practical loss of faith, even though we may still profess the creed with full conviction intellectually, and thus we're vulnerable to assimilation by the secular society. Especially young Christians today find that their coming of age is the story of, practically speaking, if not all the way, losing their religion. But because the religious aspirations of man cannot simply be suppressed or done away with, the impulse to unity with God and self-transcendence, the need for spiritual community and common action for the good, which Catholic Christianity so perfectly provides for, in the secular city, this impulse must take on a secular form. Ultimately, these forms will be failures. They'll be failures even in the early and midterm. But they won't be perfect failures. They will show themselves capable of upholding a simulacrum of Christian society, an ersatz Christianity, false, which imagines itself to have transcended the old forms and taken the best while leaving away what we don't need. Like an alcoholic whose body learns to extract some low level of nourishment from his booze because that's all it's being fed, our society will pedal on for a while with the pseudo-spiritualities. But its body becomes increasingly emaciated and sick, and its members increasingly desperate as they stumble toward rock bottom. A society too far gone in this direction cannot repair itself. Ours is such a society. It must rather be rescued, as it were, from without, a without that is also within. The seeds of the renewal of our society will come from that creative Christian minority which has re-essentialized the gospel in the ashes of its ruined heritage and nourishes again the seeds of renewal, which are the forms of Christian common life that incarnate the gospel in human society. Although it's obviously the case, a little history here of the United States. It's obviously the case that Catholics have contributed essentially to even the embryonic stages of this European society in the New World we call the United States of America, as explorers, missionaries, trappers, plantation owners. The great wave of European Catholic immigration is a phenomenon of the Industrial Revolution, the century spanning from about 1820 to 1920, and the immigrants that came to work in the rail yards, the steel mills, the flour mills, every sort of machine shop, and an industry especially dear to my heart, the breweries. You like breweries? No? Oh, a few. Okay. The Industrial Revolution was, of course, a shining and unqualified success in the thing of beauty. One thinks if one is an unreconstructed disciple of Ayn Rand, that is, by any sort of authentic Christian account, the Industrial Revolution and its accompanying Enlightenment liberal doctrine of free market capitalism was indeed a true revolution, a societal transformation, but also an upsetting of traditional society in every way: social, economic, political, religious. It brought with it all manner of injustice and profoundly deleterious effects upon family life, personal freedom, and often basic human dignity. It's against these injustices that the great trade unions arose, and Catholics were instrumental in their foundation. Partly for this reason, one supposes, the medieval guilds are often thought of as proto-unions, but this sort of basic association is wrong-headed. The origin of the unions was reactive, a mode of resistance to systemic oppression. A Christian instinct, certainly, but the medieval guilds were an entirely creative and spontaneous enterprise and the fruit of 1,000 years of Europe's digested Catholicism. As Russell Sparks notes in the Distributist Review article, What Can We Learn from the Guilds? By the way, Richard Ailman is an editor of the Distributist Review and sometimes contributor. Russell Sparks says that the guilds were not fundamentally economic associations at all, but they were religious brotherhoods, which were instrumental in bringing about the social incarnation of medieval Europe's maturing Catholic spirituality. Sparks quotes the early 20th century German historian, liberal Protestant historian, actually, Ernest Troeltsch. And Troeltsch says, this is important right here, the medieval city was a pattern of Christian society as we find it in Thomist theory. That's amazing to think about. With its cathedrals and its intensive church life, its religious confraternities and guilds, its care for the spiritual and material welfare of its inhabitants, and its educational, charitable institutions, it appears as the highest point of the medieval spirit, says Troeltsch. And so the documentation of the Catholic social teaching, which began to appear in the 19th century, didn't come out of a vacuum, but it in fact reemerged from the Church's living memory of 500 years of social incarnation of the gospel in medieval European society. In the Middle Ages, there were no social encyclicals, but rather there was Catholic society. The social encyclicals were a response, of whom our saint of the day is such a great author. The social encyclicals were a response to a destruction of the Catholic order of society, the destruction of it. They were a call not for an impossible recreation of an idealized medieval Europe, but for a creative cultural retrieval of the gospel in answer to the devastation wreaked upon European social life in post-Reformation modernity. We should be clear that Catholic society can be dead while there remain many Catholics, even many practicing Catholics. Practicing. Go to Mass. Good. That's not all there is to Catholic practice. I'm not even speaking here of the perseverance of a persecuted church in a formerly Catholic society, which has fallen under alien oppression, like Byzantine Christianity did under Muslim oppression, as the Orthodox did under Soviet oppression. I'm speaking of this new experiment of Enlightenment modernity called secular society. It's a society that cannot repair itself, for it squandered the spiritual resources necessary to engineer its renewal. The church is just that perfect society, which is the only hope for human society. And we must remember that while the church universal is that against which the gates of hell shall not prevail, some part of the church in any age and time can indeed fail and recede into irrelevance. The church, however, unlike any merely human society, always retains the resources for renewal within her because her animating spirit is the Holy Spirit, who brings the very life of God into the world as the healing of human society. There was a time when only 500 Christians existed in the entire world, but they were together, united, and waiting on the Holy Spirit to inflame them with the creative fire of renewal. And this is what we must be like. In fact, this creative minority is that which must be joined by anyone who wants to be in the center of what the Holy Spirit is doing in our time, and he's doing some amazing things. Man is not made to be alone. I think I recall having read that in some authoritative text. Man is made for society, which means for friendship, for community. This is because he's made by a God who is not alone, but who is community, friendship. When a society is healthy, man must cooperate with it, but when society is diseased, any man who wants to be healthy must revolt. But he can't be in merely negative revolt, and he can't do this all by himself. There must be an alternative community of health available to him. We've got one of those. The philosopher Alasdair MacIntyre, almost 40 years ago, famously called for a new sort of Benedictinism, which understands that the current crisis must be waited out by Christians who in repentance have dedicated themselves to relearning and then embarking upon a creative retrieval of our classical Christian culture from its foundations. This response to the barbarism of our time is not a resigned or indifferent shrugging of the shoulders. Rather, it's a tactical retreat for the sake of preparing a reformation. And this reformation must happen first on a small and local level, where we can rediscover that Christian belief means Christian life, that the creed is not merely a religious pledge of allegiance, but implies a practice of living. An intentional commitment to living Christian community will mean that Christians must step out of certain patterns of life as dictated to them by the secular technological society in order to form the basis for a more human society on truly human and therefore Christian principles. This retreat is not a flight from the world because it will be done for the sake of the world in preparation for the rebuilding of the larger society. Now, one fundamental principle of a truly Christian society is that Christians place themselves into each other's spiritual care. I mean, they truly do, and in a hyper-local way, a neighborly way, as well as in this universal way. The communion of saints must take on a concrete form in local communities. If it does not, these communities are such in name only. Until we come to truly depend on one another for the spiritual goods that we need, which goods always sacramentalize themselves in material and temporal circumstances, then we're just not living the life of the church. The guilds were a major pillar of Christian society in the Middle Ages, precisely because they facilitated this kind of local mutual dependence on spiritual goods. Let's listen again to Russell Sparks. This is the common aim of all the guilds. Whatever the individual guild did with respect to its particular craft and the issues that were special to that craft, and crafts as such, what they all had in common was that they arranged prayers in their guild church. Each guild had its own church, eventually, particularly for the souls of its deceased members. There's a recurring theme of keeping lights burning at regular masses for the souls of dead members. For example, the Guild of St. Stephen of St. Stephen's Church in London funded a permanent chaplain, provided 5 candles for the mass of a departed brother, and brought home his body if he died within 20 miles. And then Sparks quotes the great Irish Catholic historian Eamon Duffy in his book, The Stripping of the Altars, which again is, I think, another fundamental piece of literature here for our project. Duffy says, with some variations, all medieval guilds were modeled along the same lines: the maintenance of lights before images in the Blessed Sacrament, the procurement of attendance and prayers of the whole guild at funerals of deceased members, and finally the exercise of sociability and charity at a communal feast associated with the Saints' Day. I'm not suggesting, again, that the agenda of St. Joseph Guild be reduced to simply trying to copy the activity here of the medieval guilds in this sense. My point is, let's listen to the principles that are involved in their commitments. Their care is for the spiritual good of the community above all things. Again, we're not, okay, well, I said that. We've referred here to a notion, the idea that Christians must organize a strategic retreat from the secular society, which has become popularly known in Catholic circles as the Benedict option. For any who have only heard this buzzword via the transom, but who've not read Alasdair MacIntyre, Joseph Ratzinger, or Rod Dreher's book of the same name, Benedict option means everybody moved down to Clear Creek Monastery. But that's not what it means. You may be called to it, but it's not what it means to be living the Benedict option. It means what we're speaking of here, and it not only can, but in fact must be done in our major cities and large towns. That is central to the success of this movement. Dreher's book chronicles many and varied examples of how Christians the world over are forming just these minority, creative communities in rural agrarian settings, in towns and major urban areas, and even within larger institutions, secular or Christian. It's meant as an inspiration for more creativity, not as a manual or blueprint. Another thing we must say is that if this Benedict option thing we're talking about here is really a movement, it's not and simply will not be a mass movement. It would be wonderful to have 1,000 members. That's a lot. There are 825,000 Catholics in the Archdiocese. You do the math. It's a small movement. I want us to listen to Benedict XVI in closing. He's a better closer than I am. I want to explain from this prophetic and beautiful passage taken from a radio address given 50 years ago. I quote, I resist the temptation to do it in his Bavarian accent. The future of the church can and will issue from those whose roots are deep and who live from the pure fullness of their faith. It will not issue from those who accommodate themselves merely to the passing moment, or from those who merely criticize others and assume that they themselves are infallible measuring rods. Nor will it issue from those who take the easier road, who sidestep the passion of faith, declaring false and obsolete, tyrannous and legalistic, all that makes demands upon men that hurts them and compels them to sacrifice themselves. To put this more positively, the future of the church, once again as always, will be reshaped by saints, by men, that is, whose minds probe deeper than the slogans of the day, who see more than others see because their lives embrace a wider reality. Unselfishness, which makes men free, is attained only through the patience of small daily acts of self-denial. By this daily passion, which alone reveals to a man in how many ways he's enslaved by his own ego, by this daily passion and by it alone, a man's eyes are slowly opened. He sees only to the extent that he has lived and suffered. If today we're scarcely able any longer to become aware of God, it's because we find it so easy to evade ourselves and to flee from the depths of our being by means of the narcotic of some pleasure or other. Thus our own interior depths remain closed to us. If it's true that a man can see only with his heart, then how blind we are. How does all this affect the problem? It means that the big talk of those who prophesy a church without God and without faith is all empty chatter. We have no need of a church that celebrates the cult of action and political prayers. It's utterly superfluous. Therefore, it will destroy itself. What will remain is the Church of Jesus Christ, the church that believes in the God who has become man and promises us life beyond death. The kind of priest who is no more than a social worker can be replaced by the psychotherapist and other specialists. But the priest who's no specialist, who does not stand on the sidelines watching the game, giving official advice, but in the name of God places himself at the disposal of man, who is beside them in their sorrows, in their joys, in their hope, and in their fear, such a priest will certainly be needed in the future. Let us go a step farther. From the crisis of today, the church of tomorrow will emerge, a church that has lost much. She will become small and will have to start afresh more or less from the beginning. She will no longer be able to inhabit many of the edifices she built during her material prosperity. As the number of her adherents diminishes, so it will lose many of her social privileges. In contrast to an early age, it will be seen much more as a voluntary society, entered only by free decision. As a small society, it will make much bigger demands on the initiative of her individual members. Undoubtedly, it will discover new forms of ministry and will ordain to the priesthood approved Christians who pursue some profession. He's thinking about a really poor church here, by the way. In many smaller congregations or in self-contained social groups, pastoral care will normally be provided in this fashion. Alongside this, the full-time ministry of the priesthood will be indispensable as formerly. But in all of the changes at which one might guess, the church will find her essence afresh and with full conviction in that which was always at her center, faith in the triune God, in Jesus Christ, the Son of God made man, in the presence of the Spirit until the end of the world. In faith and prayer, she will again recognize the sacraments as the worship of God, and not as a subject for liturgical scholarship. The church will be a more spiritual church, not presuming upon a political mandate, flirting as little with the left as with the right. It will be hard going for the church, for the process of crystallization and clarification will cost her much valuable energy. It will make her poor and cause her to become the church of the meek. The process will be all the more arduous, for sectarian narrow-mindedness as well as pompous self-will have to be shed. One may predict that all of this will take time. The process will be long and wearisome, as was the road from the false progressivism on the eve of the French Revolution, when a bishop might be thought smart if he made fun of dogmas and even insinuated that the existence of God was by no means certain, to the renewal that began in the 19th century. But when the trial of this sifting is past, a great power will flow from a more spiritualized and simplified church. Men in a totally planned world will find themselves unspeakably lonely. If they've completely lost sight of God, they will feel the whole horror of their poverty. Then they will discover the little flock of believers as something wholly new. They will discover it as a hope that is meant for them, an answer for which they've always been searching in secret. And so it seems to me that the church is facing very hard times. The real crisis has scarcely begun. We'll have to count on terrific upheavals, but I'm equally certain about what will remain at the end. Not the church of the political cult, which is dead already, but the church of faith. It may well no longer be the dominant social power to the extent that she was until recently, but it will enjoy a fresh blossoming, like a new springtime, and be seen as man's home, where he will find life and hope beyond death.